Hello. Hello, and a very, very warm welcome. And thanks for coming, because perhaps you don't know, but we use any of the funds that come in today to help with the Kent Opportunities Fund, which helps so many very, very grateful students with their studies and other matters. So thank you for being here. And my guest today is a friend. She's a neighbor. She also happens to be one of the world's best-selling authors and writers. I cannot tell you how many literary festivals I've been to when I've been selling a couple of books, and there's been one or two people who want them signed. And I see this person here with queues of people with books this thick, stacks of books, and children so enthusiastic to meet her and to see her. So we're going to tell a few stories with the wonderful Francesca Simon in a moment. She's, of course, the creator of Horrid Henry, as you all know, and many other things, including The Monstrous Child, and most recently, Hack and Wack, which I was reading this morning in bed. And I suspect, however, at heart she's still a kind of Californian on the beach and dreaming stories in her head, and perhaps we'll find out about that. So please will you welcome Francesca Simon.
Thank you.
And I have to ask you first why you felt it necessary to bring a guard dog.
Well, I've heard, rough things about the University of Kent. I wasn't sure if we'd be safe, and I thought, I might be mobbed on stage. And this way, with my fierce protector, everyone will maintain a respectful distance. And I also thought if I was less than entertaining, you could at least enjoy Louis, who's being very good. This is his second time on stage. A friend of mine who's an actor was once looking after him doing a panto in Cambridge, and they thought it would be really fun if they just whisked him on stage, which they did, and pretended his name was Kim Kardashian. And then they got yelled at by the management because apparently they were not licensed to have animals on stage. But this is his second time, and so far I think I don't want to tempt fate. I have trusty minders ready to whisk him off if he behaves in an untoward and disrespectful fashion. I'm
sure he won't. Now, this is a slightly different format from other conversations. Let's begin with Hack and Wack, because I did read it this morning. I enjoyed it. I laughed a great deal. And maybe you should read it.
Well, do you want to know anything about it first, or just read it cold?
Whichever way you want to do it.
Okay, I'll just tell you. So Hack and Wack is my first picture book in a long time. And as you may guess from the cover, it's about two adorable, well-behaved children who do everything that they're told to do. And so I will begin. Hack and Wack. Hack! Wack! It's time for No! Stop! Hack and Wack! It's bedtime! Come back! No! We're Hack and Wack on the attack! Oh no! Save us! Help! They're back! It's Hack and Wack on the attack! They're Vikings, by the way. Roaring! Raging! Rampaging! Stay back! We're Hack and Wack on the attack. Rah! Grab a bracelet. Rah! Snatch an axe. Rah! Nab a helmet. Rah! Snag a snack. We're Hack and Wack on the attack. Thwack! Thwack! They're attacking some poor guy in the loo. Clickety! Clack! We're Hack and Wack on the... I'm sorry. We're Hack and Wack on the... Wake up! Wake up! Get out of bed! Blacktooth! Bigfoot! Spearnose! You too, Dirty Ulf. Come out to play. Rampage! Riot! Rumpus! Hooray! Crash! Smash! Splat! Crack! We're Hack and Wack! I'm sorry. We're Hack and Wack! It's bedtime, Hack and Wack. I don't want to hear a peep, because even Vikings need to sleep.
That just reminds us that Vikings had mothers who wanted bath time and bedtime to be...
They did, poor... And to have Hack and Wack as your children.
Not... Are there any hacks and whacks around here? Any?
I fear there might be.
I think so, on the attack. I mean, in terms of the inspiration of that book, it's about the Vikings, but it is about every family that you've ever met, isn't it?
Of course. I mean, what was really fun about this book was, because they're Vikings, it gives you this total liberty. So the parents say things like, no swords at the table, no axes here, but they're encouraging them to fight. And because that's what they're doing, they're Vikings. So as a writer, our lives, children's lives, are very constrained. Don't do this, don't do that, that's dangerous. So to sort of create a setting where there's no such thing as danger, because they're outside all the time. I've written a story where they steal a boat and try to go and raid an island. But they're Vikings.
So
it gives me complete freedom, and it is quite exciting and fun.
And great reaction here. Do you like doing live performance like this and seeing what happens when you...
I love it, and this is actually the first time I've read the book out loud. I read it once out loud, and Louis was in the room, and he got very agitated. But he was, I don't know how surprised he looked. But that was really a wonderful response, because I haven't read it out loud to an audience of people before. Oh, it's really fun, because one of the things about picture books, it's all about the audience. It's all about that space between the person who's reading the book and the audience and people reading it and looking at the pictures and filling in the story. So almost more than anything, you need that audience. They're a big part of a picture book.
And your illustrator, I think she did a great job, but for a number of reasons. The palette, the colours are fantastic. And also, she's very witty in some of the things that she added.
You couldn't all see. I mean, her name is Charlotte Cotterill, and she's actually just graduated from art college in Cambridge. So this is her very first picture book. And I think because she's new, no one, I've never seen a book with a color palette of this salmon-y pink color. People just don't use it, but because it's her first book, she kind of went wild, and she's really, really funny. And there's just, when you pick up the book, there's all kinds of pictures, because the thing about a picture book is the words only tell a small part of the story, and the picture is telling a big part of the story. It's like a film.
A lot of visual jokes, basically.
There's a lot of visual jokes,
and
yeah.
How did you get started? Because I mean, in your heart, you're still a Californian in a way, aren't you?
Well, I am. I mean, I may not exactly look it, but I am actually sort of a beach bunny. I really am. I grew up on the beach, and I used to never wear shoes. I was always barefoot. So when school came around, I hadn't worn shoes for 3 or 4 months. In California, in America, they have very, very, very long holidays, 12 or 13 weeks. And I remember that feeling of my feet pinching. Like in Tom Sawyer, when he has to go to school, I always felt like Tom Sawyer. I thought, what are these awful, weird things I have to put on my feet? But no, I did grow up on the beach. But I did medieval studies at university, and I like Norse sagas, I like myth, I like legends, and so I think and I have a kind of anarchic sense of humor. So I think you combine all those things.
Did you write stories in your head on the beach? I mean, one of the things about childhood that I remember as being perhaps a bit boring at the time was being bored, and then you would go and escape in your own different world because you find something to do. It's not really boring, it's just you haven't got any kind of TV or anything to stimulate you.
Well,
so
we
you find
actually
something
didn't
else.
have a TV till I was 10. I'm the eldest of, it was 3 children then, and then 4, and we lived in a very tiny house. So it was lovely to live on the beach, so I had to share a bedroom with my sister, who I did not get on with at all. So I read all the time, I think as a way of kind of shutting out the fact that I was living in a house that was really too small for our family. And so I read about 6 hours a day. So I did more reading than writing. I did write, I wrote fairy tales. I rewrote fairy tales.
And the medieval studies, I mean, one thing that I find terribly attractive about the Middle Ages is that there are stories which we know certain facts about, but you have to fill in a lot of background. And therefore, as a writer, you can create a lot. Like the Vikings, we know certain things about the Vikings, but you can do a lot of other things as well, can't you?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's an accident that a lot of number of people who write for children have been medievalists. You know, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. I know that J.K. Rowling did medieval French at university. There's a number of us who, I think, an interest in legend and story. I think everyone is hardwired to love stories, but also as a writer, I can't imagine being a writer who didn't like these stories. I mean, I love stories about adventure and being taken into places. I love stories about magic and magic adventure. But you know, it's not, I mean, I did Anglo-Saxon when I came to England, which is one of those courses. There were only 7 of us. And I always joke and say, oh yes, Anglo-Saxonists, there's always, you know, a call for people who do Old English. You know, it's one of those guaranteed jobs. But in fact, it was the most useful thing I could have studied if I had known I was going to be a writer. Because in terms of understanding English, and I love alliteration, you know, Horrid Henry, and words, the way words work, and those harsh sounds in English. There's old Anglo-Saxon, hack, whack, are probably Anglo-Saxon words. So having a feel for the language, I think, is really important.
How did, I suspect many of the people here today, especially the younger people, will love Horrid Henry, and that's one of the reasons perhaps they turned up. How did Horrid Henry come about?
Well, Horrid Henry came about, I mean, it was never meant to be more than one story, but literally, a friend of mine who was an illustrator, but she only ever drew beautiful, happy children dancing in the meadows and putting flowers, and she was just in a really bad mood. And she said, God, I wish someone would write a story about somebody horrid. And the word horrid stuck in my head because as an American, we don't say horrid, we say horrible. So it was just a slight, it's almost like something catches on your brain. And I said, oh yeah, well, Henry was horrid. Everyone said so, even his mother, which in fact is the beginning of Horrid Henry. And I thought, oh, maybe there's a little story here. So my publisher, who I just met, asked me to write a book for children who were just learning to read. And I didn't really know what that was. And for some reason, I didn't go and find out. So I just wrote this story about, you know, I had Horrid Henry, and I knew, you know, you always need somebody to fight against. So I thought, well, if he's horrid, we want somebody who is perfect. So I suddenly had Horrid Henry, Perfect Peter. I had my 2 characters, which doesn't usually happen. Usually I would have a story almost before I had a character. And I was also really interested in families, where there was the good child and the bad child. And everybody here knows, and that includes the parents, if they were the good child or the bad child. And all the kids know it too. And that can switch, but everybody knows who they were. I was the bad child.
So how many of you are the bad children? Okay. Do we have any Perfect Peters in the house? Oh,
a few.
I don't think your parents believe a word you're saying.
But the interesting thing is that the parents know themselves, whether they admit it or not, if they were. And I realized, of course, that, you know, the 2 characters were actually 2 sides of everyone in the world. But I was interested in the way that parents treated their children as if they had a good child. You know, she's so good and he's so awful. And I would hear this from people. And I thought it would be really interesting to write about a family for laughs. And also because one of the interesting things about a family, I think, is that you don't choose who you live with. You're just, you know, you don't choose your children. They don't choose you and you don't choose them. So it's like a situation comedy. Because all those famous ones, like Fawlty Towers or Father Ted, are about people trapped. They're trapped together, people who don't want to be together necessarily, who shouldn't be together, and they're stuck together like in this room or in this house or on this island. And that's what a family is to me. So I thought there would be so many funny things to write about. But it was just one story, and it turned out they turned me down because they said we needed a young story, and this is too old. But I had a brilliant editor, and she said, I'd like to make this work. Let me think about it. And she said, can you write more stories? And we'll make it for children who have just learned to read as opposed to children who are learning to read. So if she hadn't said, I would have just put it in a drawer and forgotten about it. And it did take 4 books until bookshops. It was teachers who discovered the books, but it was the independents who started putting it on their shelves. But Waterstones did not have a Horrid Henry until the 4th one, which was Horrid Henry's Knits.
Which is one of the reasons why independent bookshops are such a good thing.
Why they're such a good thing. But the other thing, of course, that's changed now is that if I was writing now, I would have been cut. Because the books, you know, they sold very, very modestly. They weren't in bookshops, but it never dawned on me that I would be. But now there's almost this attitude of 2 books and you're out. And people always expect like instant success. I mean, Horrid Henry took years and years to get established. I mean, it really did. You know, if the 4th one, so I've been writing 4, just starts to be in bookshops. It was just they'd call it, my publisher would say, oh, do you want to do one more? I'd say, okay, that'd be fun. Okay, one more, that would be nice. It was not like I sat down and suddenly there was this massive explosion of success and wonder. Not at all.
I'm fascinated that, and we're going to read a bit, at the very end, we're going to read a bit of Horrid Henry, I hope. But
we will.
I think it's interesting that it came from one word. I mean, to go back to your Anglo-Saxon, the
did.
word horrid, because you are I mean, writers obviously are into the word business, but you are particularly fascinated by words that have a kind of baggage. They have a meaning, but there's a sound and which does something.
No, it's absolutely true. You know, so many times ideas come from really tiny things, and it's not like they just arrives fully formed. It was just my thinking about it, and I just happened to be thinking, you know, my own son was 3 at the time, and friends were starting to have more than one child, and it was just, sometimes the best ideas come from combining things that don't necessarily combine, and it was just a lot of things kind of coming together. The other thing is I love comic books, always have, and that's one thing, all children's writers love comic books, read loads of comics when they were little, when they were young, and that kind of hack, whack, you know, that if you look at a Horrid Henry book and look at the dialogue, you can tell it's written by somebody, and also hack and whack, who likes comic books, who likes all that pow zap. I always have enjoyed that.
In terms of your own son, Josh, I mean, how much was he an influence in his behaviour? I'm not trying to say, is he horrid? He's lovely. I know him. He's a nice guy.
Well, he's not here, so we can talk.
We can talk about him. I mean, well, first of all, are you an embarrassment to him?
I firmly believe that parents who are not an embarrassment to their children are failing in their duty. All parents have to be embarrassing. It's very important. Yes, of course I am. When Josh was in year 1, he complained to his teacher about me and said I was too silly.
Well, he got you right then, didn't he?
It did. Yes, it did. No, I am silly. It is very true. No, the thing about Josh was that he was only 3 when I started writing them. So he was too young for them. So he wasn't necessarily... He wasn't an influence in the sense of was he horrid or perfect. In fact, I have to say he erred more probably on the perfect side. Well, I will tell you the worst thing that Josh ever did at school, because as I say, he's not here. Is he watching? I doubt it. The worst thing that Josh ever did at school, and this is just dreadful, none of you must ever do this, but when he was in nursery class, one day he ran across the carpet. Ooh. So don't do that at home, children.
Well, he could be Prime Minister, because Theresa May said the worst thing she ever did was running through a cornfield or something.
which I really enjoyed. Yeah, Josh could probably... Well, I think running across the carpet in nursery is worse. But where Josh was kind of I suppose it was more the things that Josh was concerned about, like because Josh was the youngest in his class. So he came home one day and said that everyone was losing a tooth, and he hadn't lost a tooth. So the way I would always use that is to go, what would Henry do? Because the way I write is I ask myself questions, and then the answer is often the story. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, what would Henry do? What would happen if Peter lost a tooth before Henry? Well, then he'd probably try to trick Peter into giving him the tooth and the tooth fairy. So the story kind of comes from those things. So it was Josh's, and also Josh became vegetarian when he was 8, except he hated vegetables. So that was really tricky. So I thought, well, I have to write, Horrid Henry would never be a vegetarian, but just being fussy about food, or wanting, Josh once, he said he wanted to have a jumble sale. I said, okay. And then I thought, well, what would Henry's jumble sale be? What would he want to sell? And I thought, well, he'd want to sell Peter. which is one of my favorite stories, which is called Horrid Henry Gets Rich Quick. Because Peter's really happy to be sold because Henry tells him he'll get 10p. So he sells Peter to Margaret next door because she'd always wanted a good slave. And Henry's just so happy that he's got rid of Peter and then has to buy him back. But it's particularly funny to me that Peter, because he's little and he just wants to please, is so happy to go along with this. Because that is the thing that people, I think kids and people enjoy the most, is about all the ways that Henry tries to trick Peter. Because we all think that we're the people who are doing the tricking and not the ones who are being tricked. And so it's those kind of schemes. Because like I say, they are, Horrid Henry and Perfect Peter, I realized this after about book 5, are two sides of everyone, that everyone has within them that kind of desire to be good, to create, to build the castle, and then the desire to stomp on it. And so it's allowing which of those two out.
We're going to put the lights up in a minute and ask for questions or thoughts from everybody in the floor, particularly some of our younger visitors. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things you've done for older children.
Yes.
The Monstrous Child and so on. You know, Hell.
Yes.
Hell, another great name.
Well, this is, you know, I do have a really strong interest in Norse mythology, and Hel is the Norse goddess of the dead, and no prizes for guessing where we get our word for hell, except hers is spelled H-E-L, yeah. And I realized that the Norse goddess of the dead was a child, a young girl, because she's one of Loki's 3 monstrous children, and they're all young. So I thought that was just an amazing idea of the person who rules the underworld is this young girl. And who's absolutely, and also because she's, the thing about the Norse goddess of the dead is that from the waist up, she's a perfectly lovely young woman, and from the waist down, she's a corpse. So I thought, it's a very interesting way to talk about feeling uncomfortable in your body, feeling that your body, that you are monstrous. I wasn't necessarily thinking about that at the time, but I often realize the sort of themes of my book after I've written it. I thought, wow, this is all about, all about being a teenager and being trapped, because the other thing about the goddess Hel is that she, in the myth, is lying in this rotting room, on this rotting bed, and she just lies there. And I thought, this is somebody who's really depressed. And I had this vision of like this teenager who painted her bedroom black and just doesn't leave her room. And so, of course, I asked myself questions. Why is she like this? So the book is almost an attempt to answer that question. How did Hel end up in this room on this rotting bed for eternity? So that was the book. I have to say I loved writing it, but this was a very odd book because the first sentence came to me, this has really never happened before. I was on the subway in New York early in the morning, and I'm sitting on the subway, and this voice comes into my head, and the voice says, "You'd think after my brother the snake was born, they'd have stopped at 1. And I thought, I know who that is. That's Hel. She has just spoken to me. And I thought, I've got that voice. I instantly had that kind of, yeah, well, Mom, yeah, what do you think it's like for me? That sort of, that angry, annoyed, funny teenage voice. And I thought, that's the book. And I'd never written in first person before, which I enjoyed doing. It's quite interesting, but in order to write in first person, you obviously have to have a really strong voice, because that's who we're going to be spending our time with. And if you're not enjoying that voice, you're not going to enjoy the book.
And also, well, I mean, it seems to me that throughout everything you do, what works with all ages is that it is, I don't even know if this is a word, relatable. We all know, I don't know many Norse goddesses, teenagers who are actually the goddess of death. Some of your best friends. But we all know, we all went through the teenage years, or we're going to go through it for some of us. Of course. And we get the story. We get the big picture story.
But I think that's really important. I think that, sort of retelling these stories have lasted for a reason. And one way that they last is that people keep telling them in a way that makes sense. And I think these issues of feeling, of growing up in a family and your parents are fighting all the time and you can't bear your siblings and you have issues with them and you feel that you don't belong. I mean, these are so universal. And it's just really explicit in the myth, to be half corpse. She's got a lot to be angry about.
Can I ask just we'll bring up the lights, just one more question before we do. Have you ever felt under any pressure from publishers to keep producing the same thing? Because, I talked to a lot of authors and one of them said to me, I sometimes feel I'm being treated like McDonald's. They just want the same hamburger that I did yesterday and the same hamburger I did the day before, and I don't want to do hamburgers, I want to do fish and chips.
I mean, that is a really interesting question. In order to not be in a sausage factory, I only ever wrote one Horrid Henry book a year, and my publishers were very good about that. But I just said, I'm doing 4 stories, 1 a year, because I want each book to be better than the previous one, and it's so easy if you do them too quickly to fall into a formula. Because it's very interesting, a lot of children send me their Horrid Henry stories that they've written, and you can see it just laid out, what the bits that they've identified as this is the essence of the story. Yes, I think that there is that, because it makes sense for the publisher, because they know this works and there's a huge demand for it. I've always resisted. But then, I moved to Faber to do my older books.
So you've got a different publisher
I have
for
a
that,
different
so they're
publisher.
a different set of brains that want different things.
Exactly. But no, I think it's a real problem, I think, for writers. Because you don't go into writing because you want to keep writing the same thing. You want to keep, there's this tension because you want to keep, in order to continue to be interested and excited by what you're doing, you always want to challenge yourself. I mean, I'm writing an opera at the moment. And because you start thinking, well, what's the worst thing that can happen? And you think, well, the worst thing that can happen is that it'll be terrible. Can I deal with that? And you think, yeah, I can deal with that, so I'm going to do it. So that for me is very exciting, maybe less exciting for other people, but very exciting for me. And I think as a writer, you would just fall apart if you just did the same thing. It would be very hard to kind of keep the excitement and the interest and the sort of spark of it.
Let's bring the lights up and let's have some thoughts or questions from anybody on the floor, and maybe those of you who are older will maybe encourage some of the younger ones to say something. There's a girl right at the back there, and then there's a couple of boys down here. We'll start with the girl up there, and then there's a boy down here too.
So good.
How many books have you written?
I have written over 50 books. I've lost count of how many books I've written. I should go and count them all up. I've written 24 Horrid Henry books and 1 Horrid Henry picture book. So that's 25 Horrid Henrys. It's well over 50. It's probably about 65 now. It's a lot of books.
That is a lot.
My poor hand.
There were 2 boys down there, and then there's a boy in a red jacket down there, please. Yeah, and there were 3 boys over here, actually.
Do you think that you might expand into other mythologies?
Oh, God, great question. I have written a book about Greek mythology, which I've always liked, called Helping Hercules, about a girl who gets a magic coin, because I do love stories about magic, and I like stories about magic that doesn't quite work. So it's a magic coin that gives you some of what you want. So she goes back to help the Greek. She takes part in every single Greek myth. My favorite one was The Judgment of Paris, where she offers Paris bubblegum. So he chooses her as the fairest of them all, because he's never had sugar. So it's like, oh, wow, bubblegum. So, yeah, I am silly. But
even gods can be bribed, or
even
mythological
gods can be bribed. So I've done the Greek, but the Norse mythology is interesting because it's less well known, even though it is the mythology of Britain. So, for example, we refer to Norse mythology every single day, which you don't even realize that the word Tuesday is actually Tyr, the god Tyr, and Wednesday is, does anybody know what Wednesday is? Woden's Day, the god Woden. And Thursday, what's Thursday? Come on. Thor's Day.
Yes, boy in the red top, and then there's a girl up at the back too, and a couple more boys. Go ahead.
So, if Horrid Henry was a grown-up, what job would he have?
That is such a hard question.
And if Perfect Peter were also grown up, what would he have?
Oh gosh, Perfect Peter would probably be an actuary or something. What do you think, Horrid Henry? It's very hard for me to imagine him grown up. Do you have any thoughts about what he might be? No. You don't? That's why you're asking. I was hoping you might have an idea and then help me out. I don't know that he'd be Prime Minister. I think he could kind of go in many different directions because, you know, he doesn't have any discipline. So however creative he is, and one of the things about Henry is he's actually really creative, but in order to be creative, you do have to sit down and do the work, so I'm not sure Henry would. He always has lots of ideas about, you know, he's thought about being a chef or cutting hair or, you know, making loads of money. It changes all the time. I actually don't know. I never think, you know, I don't even know the names of his parents. You may have noticed that Henry's parents have no names, and I don't even know what they are.
There's a couple of girls up there. Was another boy down here as well?
Such a good
We'll do a boy down there, and then there's 2 or 3 up there. He might have been presenting Top Gear. I can see Horrid Henry presents Top Gear.
I could definitely see him do that. Yes, no, that's a good idea. He would probably love that. He would love that.
Yes.
Why did you want to be an author, not an illustrator?
Why did I want to be an author?
Not an illustrator.
Not an illustrator. That, actually, you know, no one has ever asked me that question, and there's a really, there's a very specific answer, which is that the best drawing that I can do is a stick person. So illustrator and champion skier were never on my and footballer were never on my list. Author because I love to read. And in order to, if anyone here who wants to write, reading is so important. You just read, and you keep a notebook of any ideas you have. See, this is a young author. I love, because I do love words, I love books, I like being with books. One of the things I always used to do as a child is I love the smell of books. So I was always smelling books, and I would come downstairs and my face would be blue. And we could never work out why I had a blue face. And it was because the ink on the pages used to be, I think this may have been sorted out. It would just, there'd be the very faintest bit of blue. Yeah. And because I was always smelling them, I would have this blue face. We said, where's this blue face coming from? We had a lot of discussion in my family about my blue face. So I just like being with books. It's just my favorite and best thing in the world. And everything about books appeals to me. So.
Now, there are lots of others. There's a boy there, and then there's a couple of people, 3 people in the row up there. Maybe we can do some of those. And then there's somebody else over. Yes, I'll come to you in a minute.
Are you going to write any more Horrid Henry books?
I'm not at the moment. I have written 94 Horrid Henry stories. That is, 96. Yeah, I can't even keep it. I've written 96 Horrid Henry stories. That is a lot of stories. So I've written 24 books, 96 stories. So for the moment, no. I kind of feel I thought I could never write more than 1. And then I managed to do 2. And that felt like a miracle. So, and I've also, you know, get a lot of letters from kids saying, please, can you write something longer? You know, I've read all Horrid Henrys. Can you make them longer? Can you write older things? And so it's been, you know, I never want to say never, 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 never. But at the moment, I don't really have Horrid Henry ideas. I think I'm going to write some older Hack and Wack stories, and I think there's obviously a bit of Horrid Henry that I've just transplanted into Viking times, except Hack and Wack are equally terrible.
Yeah, you don't have the perfect Peter.
Well, I've been toying with a girl named Helga Goldhair, who's the one goody in the village.
the goody Viking.
Yeah.
There's 2 or 3 up there, and also is there somebody over here? Yes, go ahead.
Who are the first people to read one of your books?
Who are the first people to read one of my books? Well, usually my son or my husband very patiently listen. My son gets irritated. He's still a student, and so he finds it annoying that he will hear gales of laughter coming from my office because I'm laughing so much at my own jokes. But I said, if I don't find it funny, why should anybody else? So I read all my things out loud. So I'm probably my first reader in the sense, and I think adult authors should do that. I think it would improve their books enormously. Because if you read your own books out loud and you find yourself getting a bit bored or cutting things down, you need to pay attention to that. So yeah, my family, and then if I find any children, like Gavin Esler comes equipped with children. So they have been read to. I also used to go into my son's school every week, and I would read stories to them and also read anything that I was working on. Because when I first wrote Horrid Henry, in fact, I've talked about it with this boy. He remembers, I was impressed he was 8 years old that he could read it, because I didn't know, my son was 3. And I gave him the manuscript of Horrid Henry with the crossouts to read. So he was the first person who ever read a Horrid Henry.
And he laughed.
He did, but we didn't know it was going to be Horrid Henry. It was just, will you read my new story? Okay.
Yes, who's next? Yes. And there's a girl down here who's been waiting for a little while.
Are you going to write any more picture books?
Yes, I love writing picture books, and my next picture book is called The Goat Cafe. And the idea of The Goat Cafe came because I was in France, and there were these goats next door, and they sneaked into the garden and ate everything. So I thought it'd be very funny to write a book from the point of view of the goats, because they just think this is laid out for them. It's like our tea that we're going to have afterwards. This is like goat tea. So that's my next picture book, and that was huge fun to write.
Yes.
When you said that you wrote Horrid Henry, got the characters about Horrid Henry and Perfect Peter, where you have to have an enemy and a good guy. How did you get all the other characters? Because they're not enemies or good people.
That's a great question. Because I started with Horrid Henry and Perfect Peter, I started thinking about adjectives. So rude or sour or moody. I created the characters by coming up with an adjective and then matching them to a name. But I will tell you something, which is that Moody Margaret started out as a boy. And he was called Moody Martin. And Martin happens to be the name of my husband. And this will shock you all. But when he read the story, he didn't really want to be in a book called Moody Martin. But rather than saying, take my name out, what he very cleverly said, which was correct, he said, you have a lot of boys. Wouldn't it be better if Moody Martin was a girl? And I said, yes, you're right. Moody Margaret, a combination of Margaret Thatcher and me as a child. So that's how Moody Margaret came into being. Because the other thing about Moody Martin that didn't work was that he was too like Horrid Henry. And Moody Margaret suddenly had a completely different energy. And I thought, yes, who's the only person who can defeat Horrid Henry? It's Moody Margaret. She is one tough girl. And so that was a very, very good suggestion, even though it came from selfish motives.
Who's got the microphone? Where are you? Yes, go ahead.
Who are you most like in Horrid Henry?
Oh dear.
Good question.
Well, I think I'm most like Moody Margaret, probably. But the thing is that all the characters are actually aspects of everybody. So Weepy William is like all of us when just everything is going wrong, except everything goes wrong for him. He's always the one who doesn't remember to bring things and loses things. Moody Margaret, I mean, I disagree with this very much, but my siblings say I was very bossy. And I can't imagine why they would think that, but they claim I was a very bossy child. And so probably Margaret. Henry is more, I was actually really, really fantastically well behaved at school. I was really impeccable. And then I'd come home and start slamming doors and screaming. So I was kind of both Horrid Henry and Perfect Peter in different locations. But I probably identify with Margaret the most.
I'm fascinated, yet again, though. I don't know many authors who start the character with the name. I know a lot of authors who have an idea for a character and literally go to graveyards and look at names of people or look at newspaper columns and try to figure out what would be the appropriate name. And you don't even start with a name, you start with an adjective.
I started with an adjective. Again, you see, medieval studies is the way to go. Because in the Middle Ages, there were all these, it was about people having humors, people having aspects of themselves, and the idea of just having people who only are one thing. I mean, I had to be nice to my son, whose name is Josh, so I called Jolly Josh. But most everybody there, they all have to be awful. Like this absolutely angelic and wonderful girl came up to me once. She was 5. She was actually Nicolette Jones's daughter, who's the children's book editor of the Sunday Times. And she said, "Can I be in a Horrid Henry book?" And I said, "Well, what's your name?" And she said, "Rebecca." And I said, "Rabid Rebecca, the babysitter from hell." So yeah, that was unusual that I did Rebecca, but it was. I usually don't come up with the characters' names. The Horrid Henry was different because it was sort of as needed. The characters would just come, and it's just very funny to have this idea that you are only one thing.
Who's got the microphone? There's two over there, and then have we got any up here in a minute? Yes.
You're being so good.
Yes, go ahead. Maybe you could pass it along to the others too when you're finished.
What's your favourite Horrid Henry book that you've written? Why?
My favorite Horrid Henry book. I don't usually have a favorite book. My favorite story is Horrid Henry Gets Rich Quick, about when he sells Perfect Peter as a slave, because there's just something so ludicrous about it. And he's so happy, and then his mother is so angry. And Peter is next door fanning Margaret. She's lying there and saying, "Another drinks!" And Peter doesn't know what to do. I don't know. That story is so outrageous. So I do love that one. I like the zombie vampire as well. And the Horrid Henry's injection, because I'm very frightened of injections. And so we have this picture of this nurse coming like this with the needle. And Tony Ross drew it so that the needle comes off the page. It's so enormous. It's like a big school, because we'd all have to go to have injections together. And I'd always go, them first, because they didn't care, my younger brother and sister. They would just go stick their arm out. And I'd go, no. So I like that one too.
Yes.
How old is Louis, and what's the funniest thing he's ever done?
So how old is Louis, and what was the other question about him?
What's the funniest thing he's ever done?
Oh gosh, what is the funniest thing Louis ever done?
He's not done it yet. He's going to do it within the next 5 minutes, maybe.
Louis is a Tibetan Spaniel, and he's 2 years old. I think the funniest thing that Louis has done, there's two funny things. One is he loves underwear. And so he's actually never destroyed anything in the house, but he likes moving things around. So if there is any underwear being dried on any, what are those things, a drying rack, Louis will go and grab them, and he runs around the house wearing all these underwear because he's sort of scooped them up. And so that makes him very happy. And the other thing he does is he loves mats. He loves doormats. And a friend of mine who lives in a building with lots of flats sometimes looks after him. And Louis will stop outside every door to roll around the mat. And then he goes, "Rah!" And he's so happy and waves his legs in the air. So... Are you glad you asked that question?
Yes, go ahead.
How old were you when you wrote your first book?
I was 8 when I started writing my first stories. But what I always say to people who want to write is the most important thing is to finish them, which I never did. I always just left them dangling in the air. You have to finish your stories. It's so easy to start a story and it's so hard to finish. But you can start with the end first. There is no law that says you have to write beginning, middle, end. You can write the end first. And then it's easier kind of to get there.
Do you sometimes get to the end and then rewrite because the end is needs a different beginning?
I
Let's put it
rarely
that way.
know. I don't always know what the end is. And so when I wrote The Monstrous Child, the end happened as I wrote it. I really didn't know how it was going to end. That was kind of exciting. Because I get bored. There's two kinds of writers. There's writers who plan everything. I bet you're a planner.
No, I'm not.
You're not? Okay.
Absolutely not.
There are two kinds of writers. Gavin and I belong in the non-planning school. I make notes, and I have to know who my character is and what they want. Once I know those things, I can start to write. There's other people like Mallory Blackman or J.K. Rowling who plan everything. They know everything that's going to happen. I would just get bored. To me, that would be like painting by numbers. But people divide into two. I know Jacqueline Wilson is like me and doesn't plan, because we were sitting together at a talk that Mallory Blackman was giving, and she held up these terrifying notebooks. And I just went like this to Jackie and said, "Do you do that?" She went, "No." "Do you?" "No." So we were both kind of in awe of these notebooks of Mallory's.
Yeah. Where's the microphone? And, well, there's a couple right at the back. Is there anybody else on this side? Yes, there's a girl there in red just behind you. Right behind you. Yes, go ahead.
In the Horrid Henry books, how did you get the inspiration for the costumes that the characters wear?
Great question. How did I get the inspiration for the costumes? Well, I'm really lucky in that I work with a brilliant, brilliant illustrator named Tony Ross. And he came up with all the clothes that everybody wears, because I'm a very easygoing writer. I never tell illustrators what to do, because I always think you're going to get much better illustrations if your job is to choose a great illustrator and then let them do what they want so they can bring their ideas. But one of the things Tony told me is that you always have people dressed in the same clothes so you can recognize them, and they have to be recognizable from the front and the back. So that's why Henry has that stripe on his clothes. But luckily, Tony came up with all the clothes. I just went, yeah.
Well, because you'd have drawn stickmen.
I'd have drawn stickmen who would all have looked exactly the same. Terrible.
Yes, where's it? Yes, go ahead.
In the Horrid Henry joke book, what's your favourite joke?
In the Horrid Henry joke book, what's my favorite joke? Oh, my problem is, I only like really stupid jokes. I mean, really, really stupid, terrible jokes. And if I tell my favorite stupid, terrible joke, you will just, all your respect for me will fall away. Oh, do I have to tell this terrible joke? Okay, I like this joke, but anyway. And it is in the Horrid Henry joke book. Okay. Let me see if I can remember. What happens if you fall asleep under a car? You wake up oily in the morning. I think it's actually a really funny joke. I said I love stupid jokes. I don't think they get much dumber than that one.
Please, could nobody ask that question?
Please, that is the most dreadful question I've ever been.
Yes, go ahead.
Do you like that your book has been turned into a movie?
Do I like that?
Your book has been turned into episodes.
Not really, no, because I don't have anything to do with the TV show, and I don't think, really understand the books. And this happens, but I don't think that the TV episodes reflect the books accurately. I don't think that they have the humor of the books. And the other thing about Horrid Henry is that he doesn't plot, you may have noticed. It's more impulsive. It's actually not funny if he plots. So no, I'm not very keen on them. But on the other hand, if it brings more people to the books, then I'm happy.
Yes, go ahead.
What gave you the idea for Prissy Polly and Vomiting Vera?
What gave me the idea of what?
For Prissy Polly and Vomiting Vera.
For Prissy Polly and
Vomiting Vera.
Vomiting Vera. Well, I wanted to have, I thought it'd be very funny to have a character who was always going, eek, dirt, and eek, this, because I thought there would be we'd have a lot of fun with someone like that. And then because I was around babies, and as we know, babies occasionally vomit. And I just thought it would be very funny to have someone as silly as Prissy Polly being stuck with a baby who just vomited all the time. So it was just to be silly and funny. I don't know anyone named Prissy Polly, but I don't really like prissy people. So it just amused me. Like I said, you don't choose your children. So she's very ill-suited to have a child.
Yes.
Why is Henry so horrid to his parents?
Why is Henry so horrid to his parents? That is an excellent question, and I would have thought you might have said, why are Henry's parents so horrid to him? Because they're always saying, oh, Henry, you know, why aren't you as wonderful as Peter? I think that Henry's kind of angry, actually, because I think his parents definitely are more comfortable with Peter, and that they aren't really aware of what they're doing. By dividing their children, they're really encouraging this situation. But the other thing is that Henry is someone who, in our lives, I mean, we're all always thinking about consequences. Like, you know, don't do this and don't do that. And Henry never worries about consequences, whereas Peter only thinks about consequences. So my idea of Peter was that he is the child that parents are supposedly always trying to get their children to be. Like sometimes as parents, if we listen to ourselves, our whole conversation with our children can be, sit up straight, eat that, put your fork down, stop bothering your sister, leave that alone, do this, do that, sit up, have you done your homework? And you can just go on and on and on and on and on. And I thought it'd be very interesting to have a child who just did everything. But the weird thing for me is I thought parents would love Peter, and they don't. And I think because their own inner Horrid Henry revolts against this child. But I genuinely thought all the parents would say, why can't you be more like Peter? And they don't like Peter. There's something, even though he does what they want, what they supposedly are trying to get. When you actually get that result, oh, aren't I good? Aren't I wonderful? I've done this, I've done that. You don't think, oh, my lovely child. You think,
Boring.
Boring, yeah.
We have time for one or two more questions. Yes, go on.
What was the last book you wrote?
Well, the last big book I wrote was The Monstrous Child, the book about hell, is Hack and Wack, I suppose, my last published book, and then The Goat Cafe, which I think I might have written before Hack and Wack. Sometimes, I think because it took a while to find, it takes a while to find a good illustrator, and we needed to find somebody who could draw very funny goats. And a lot of illustrators, that was interesting, a lot of illustrators actually don't really like drawing children. They much prefer drawing animals, and some illustrators prefer children or children to animals, and Charlotte definitely prefers people to animals. It's just a preference.
I was thinking, actually, when you were talking about Perfect Peter, I was thinking it's also the same relationship with our pets. You want your pet to behave, but actually we don't. We like it when they do crazy, stupid, daft things. It's so much more...
I'm very happy that Louis is asleep on the stage, so he has to choose his moment. I like how zen he is. He's just keeping an eye on me to see, he doesn't want me to walk off and leave him behind. There is something in that we are both those things. We all have those qualities within us, and it's I think, and I believe this really strongly. Adults love reading murder mysteries and crime novels. We like going to the theater and seeing people behaving really badly. We love seeing other people behave badly because it's a way of enjoying that thrill, but without being punished. So it's absolute perfection. So you get all the joy and the glee of behaving badly and none of the consequences. Mm-hmm. And so Horrid Henry is literally a Western for kids. That's why it's so important to read things like this and to go up, because you do have these violent feelings. Children have really violent emotions and feelings, and I would say things like, you say, I hate my brother, and parents always say, no, you don't. Because it's uncomfortable for the parents, and so there is something about allowing the expression of uncomfortable emotion that I think is very important.
Yes.
What books are you reading?
What's Louis what?
What books are you reading? What books do you read?
Oh, what
Books
books
are you
do
reading?
I read? I read everything. I love reading children's books. I love reading, I particularly like Victorian novels that are like this thick. That's probably my favorite kind of book to read. But I'm about to start Lincoln in the Bardo, which just won the Booker Prize. Pretty much if anyone recommends a book to me, I'll read it. So I was in Faber. I recorded myself reading Hack and Wack, and they said, oh, and Faber have wonderful books. They said, oh, you can help yourself. So I did. I always bring a big bag. So I said, oh, can I have Paul Auster's book? Yeah. I do like Victorian novels, though.
Trollope is a big
Trollope
favourite
is
of yours.
my,
Anthony Trollope.
I adore Anthony Trollope, yeah.
Yes.
Why do you have different illustrators for different books?
That's an excellent question. Well, you illustrate, just like writers are good at writing certain things and not good at writing other things, which is something I didn't realize. I thought if you were a writer, you could write everything. It's not true. So different illustrators have different things that they do well. Like Tony Ross says, he will never draw a horse because he just can't do it. And if he draws, because of the legs, and if he has to draw a horse, they're always in long grass. So you don't have to see the legs. He said he just can't do it. So different illustrators draw things. Some illustrators are fantastic with color, or some illustrators are really funny, or some illustrators are very atmospheric and ghostly. So you have to look at what you've written. It was interesting getting, I wrote a book called The Sleeping Army, and it had to be somebody who could do like funny adventure, not animals, but funny adventure. And so you look and think, who can do this? Who can do this? But just because you're a good artist doesn't mean you're good at drawing everything.
Now let me ask everybody, would anybody like to hear Francesca read a bit of Horrid Henry? Yes. Yes. Right. Well, before we do, I'd just like to again thank everybody for being here. There is tea over in Darwin and a book signing, so please come to that if you would like to have your book signed or buy a book. But let's end then with Francesca reading a little bit of Horrid Henry.
Well, the story I'm going to read is part of a story I wrote, which is one of my favorites, called Horrid Henry Meets the Queen. And I'll just tell you how I got the idea for this. Remember, you get ideas everywhere? I was again sitting on the tube. Now, this is a coincidence. I do not get all my ideas on the tube. But I picked up one of those free newspapers, and there was a picture of this little boy basically screaming. So I was, of course, intrigued. Why is this child screaming? And it turned out that Prince Charles had been to visit his nursery. And this child said, I hate Prince Charles, make him go away. So I thought, what would happen if the Queen came to Henry's school? And so that's how I ended up writing this story. So this is Horrid Henry Meets the Queen. Perfect Peter bowed to himself in the mirror. Your Majesty, he said, pretending to present a bouquet. Welcome to our school, Your Majesty. My name is Peter, Your Majesty. Thank you, Your Majesty. Goodbye, Your Majesty. Slowly, Perfect Peter retreated backwards, bowing and smiling. Oh, shut up, snarled Horrid Henry. He glared at Peter. If Peter said, Your Majesty, one more time, he would. Horrid Henry wasn't sure what he'd do, but it would be horrible. The Queen was coming to Henry's school, the real live Queen. Yet for some reason, Horrid Henry had not been asked to give the Queen a bouquet. Instead, the head, Mrs. Oddbod, had chosen Peter. Peter? Why, stupid, smelly, old, ugly toad Peter? It was so unfair. Just because Peter had more stars than anyone in the Good as Gold book, was that any reason to choose him? Henry should have been chosen. He would do a much better job than Peter. Besides, he wanted to ask the Queen how many TVs she had. Now he'd never get the chance. Your Majesty, said Peter, bowing. Your Majesty, mimicked Henry, curtsying. Perfect Peter ignored him. He'd been ignoring Henry a lot ever since he'd been chosen to meet the Queen. Come to think of it, everyone had been ignoring Henry. Isn't it thrilling, said Mum for the millionth time. Isn't it fantastic, said Dad for the billionth time. No, Henry said. Who'd want to hand some rotten flowers to a stupid queen anyway? Bow, bouquet, answer her question, walk away, muttered Perfect Peter. Then he paused. Or is it bouquet, bow? Horrid Henry had had just about enough of Peter showing off. You're doing it all wrong, said Henry. No, I'm not, said Peter. Yes, you are, said Henry. You're supposed to hold the bouquet up to her nose so she can have a sniff before you give it to her. Perfect Peter paused. No, I'm not, said Peter. Horrid Henry shook his head sadly. I think we'd better practice, he said. Pretend I'm the Queen. He picked up Peter's shiny silver crown, covered in fool's jewels, and put it on his head. Perfect Peter beamed. He'd been begging Henry to practice with him all morning. Ask me a question the Queen would ask, said Peter. Horrid Henry considered. Why are you so smelly, little boy? said the Queen, holding her nose. The Queen wouldn't ask that, gasped Perfect Peter. Yes, she would, said Henry. Wouldn't, would, and I'm not smelly. Horrid Henry waved his hand in front of his face. Pooh, said the Queen. Take this smelly boy to the tower. Stop it, Henry, said Peter. Ask me a real question, like my name or what year I'm in. What? Sorry, so bad. Why are you so ugly? said the Queen. I haven't read this for a while. Mom! wailed Peter. Henry called me ugly and smelly. Don't be horrid, Henry, shouted Mom. Do we have time?
We have time.
Do you want me to practice with you or don't you? said Henry. Practice, sniffed Peter. Well, go on then, said Henry. Perfect Peter walked up to Henry and bowed. Wrong, said Henry. You don't bow to the Queen, you curtsy. Curtsy, said Peter. Mrs. Oddbod hadn't said anything about curtsying. But I'm a boy. The law was changed, said Henry. Everyone curtsies now. Peter hesitated. Are you sure? Yes, said Henry. And when you meet the Queen, you put your thumb on your nose and wriggle your fingers like this. Perfect Peter gasped. Mrs. Oddbod hadn't said anything about thumbs on noses. But that's rude, said Perfect Peter. Not to the Queen, said Horrid Henry. You can't just say hi to the Queen like she's a person. She's the Queen. There are special rules. If you get it wrong, she can chop off your head. Chop off his head. Mrs. Oddbod hadn't said anything about chopping off heads. That's not true, said Peter. Yes, it is, said Henry. Isn't? Horrid Henry sighed. If you get it wrong, you'll be locked up in the tower, he said. It's high treason to greet the Queen the wrong way. Everyone knows that. Perfect Peter paused. Oh, Mrs. Oddbod hadn't said anything about being locked up in the tower. I don't believe you, Henry, said Peter. Henry shrugged. Okay. Just don't blame me when you get your head chopped off. I must be feeling very relaxed. I have never started laughing when I'm reading one of my own stories. I do at home, but not in public.
You know what? Everybody was laughing. If you hadn't been laughing, you'd be the only one here. Our thanks again to you for coming. Please come and join us for tea. And our big thanks to Francesca.
Thank you very much. Thanks. That was very fun.
Oh, and to Louis.
Yes, has he been good?